Next up, we have Hannah Pickard. I'm going to talk about social anxiety and mechanisms.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about some of my PhD research that has been focusing on mechanisms associated with social anxiety in autistic and neurotypical adolescents. So social anxiety is commonly characterised as an intense fear of social situations. And we know that autistic children and adolescents often experience many anxiety disorders. And one of the most common anxiety disorders experienced by this group is often social anxiety. And we know that social anxiety typically has an onset towards early to mid-adolescence. And so this is why this research project, which is part of my PhD, is focusing on mechanisms that could be associated with social anxiety during this developmental period. So the first mechanism we're interested in is intolerance of uncertainty, which is often described as a tendency to react negatively to different uncertain or ambiguous situations. And there's been a great deal of research, particularly from Jackie Rogers' lab, showing that increased intolerance of uncertainty is associated with increased anxiety both in autistic and in neurotypical children. The second mechanism that we're interested in focusing on is sensory processing, which includes both hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity. And there's also been a wealth of research showing that those who have more severe sensory difficulties have greater anxiety symptoms, but this hasn't been looked at in relation to social anxiety. The third mechanism we're interested in is alexithymia, which is described as difficulties in identifying and describing one's emotions. And we know that there are elevated rates of alexithymia in the autistic population. And there's been some research at King's showing that autistic adolescents who have higher rates of alexithymia have greater anxiety compared to autistic adolescents with lower rates of alexithymia, potentially suggesting a link between alexithymia and anxiety in these individuals. And the final mechanism we're interested in, sorry about the icons moving, is emotion regulation. And that's often described as an ability to modulate or regulate one's emotional experiences in everyday situations. And there's also been a wealth of research showing that when anxious youths are quite anxious, they tend to use more maladaptive emotion regulation strategies, for example, suppression. And there's also been some work by Swain and colleagues showing that greater emotion dysregulation predicts increased social anxiety. And so those are the four mechanisms that we're interested in this study, although we have looked at many more mechanisms beyond this. And our main research questions are, which mechanisms are associated with social anxiety in autistic and neurotypical adolescents? We're also interested in understanding whether any of these mechanisms are specifically associated with social anxiety in autistic adolescents. And also understanding a bit more about what are the interrelationships between these mechanisms and how do they contribute towards social anxiety. And so for this study, I recruited a sample of 61 autistic young people between the ages of 11 and 17 years old and 62 neurotypical young people. And all of these individuals had an IQ greater than 70 and a word reading age greater than 10 years old. So just moving on to some of the findings from our analysis. So in terms of group differences in terms of mental health, we can see that the autistic and neurotypical adolescents didn't differ in terms of any of the mental health, self-reported mental health questionnaires, including social anxiety, fear of negative evaluation, trait anxiety, depression, or externalizing and internalizing problems. However, we did see that parents of autistic adolescents reported greater externalizing and internalizing problems compared to parents of neurotypical adolescents. With regards to our mechanisms, we found that neurotypical adolescents reported greater hyposensitivity compared to autistic adolescents. And we found that parents of autistic adolescents reported greater intolerance of uncertainty compared to parents of neurotypical adolescents. However, we didn't find any group differences in any of the emotional mechanisms or hypersensitivity or child-reported intolerance of uncertainty. And so to look at some of the associations in tackling our first hypothesis, these associations are with our mechanisms of interest and social anxiety split by autistic and neurotypical adolescents. So what we can see is that across both groups, higher self-reported rates of social anxiety are associated with greater alexithymic traits, a heightened use of maladaptive emotion regulation strategies, greater hypersensitivity, and greater intolerance of uncertainty as reported by both child and parent. And the only notable difference that we can see is that social anxiety in the autistic group is associated with elevated hyposensitivity. However, one of the most important things I think to take away from this slide is that we see very similar patterns of associations across both of these groups of individuals. And given that we did see very similar patterns of associations across these groups, we thought about collapsing both our autistic and neurotypical adolescents into one group and looking dimensionally at ASD symptomatology and looking at the mechanisms and interrelationships between the pathway from autistic traits to social anxiety. And so I'm going to present some of the structural equation modelling data now. So this is a model from the total sample, so that's 123 individuals, collapsing both the autistic and neurotypical sample together. And what we can see is that autistic traits, as reported by parents, predicts increased intolerance of uncertainty and also predicts increased hypersensitivity. And if we look towards the central part of the model, we can see that hypersensitivity predicts increased alexithymia, and that alexithymia predicts increased intolerance of uncertainty as well. And what we can see is that when we control for levels of autistic traits, alexithymia and hypersensitivity predicts increased social anxiety symptoms as self-reported by the child. However, we can see that intolerance of uncertainty does not predict social anxiety symptoms in this model. In the autistic sample, so I should mention that we wanted to split and look within our autistic and neurotypical sample just in case there were any findings that were hidden by collapsing across our groups. And so we can see two notable differences in this model. Firstly, we can see that alexithymia no longer predicts increased intolerance of uncertainty. And we can also see that when we control for levels of autistic traits, intolerance of uncertainty, as well as alexithymia and hypersensitivity, all predict increased social anxiety symptoms. So now for our neurotypical sample, we can see, again, one distinct difference in this sample. We see that when we control for levels of autistic traits, intolerance of uncertainty no longer predicts social anxiety symptoms, but we still see that increased alexithymia and increased hypersensitivity is predicting increased social anxiety symptoms as reported by the children. So just to sum up some of the main findings, so we found that higher self-reported social anxiety is associated with greater alexithymic traits, more use of maladaptive emotion regulation strategies, greater hypersensitivity and intolerance of uncertainty as reported by child and parent. We also see very similar associations across both of our groups, and bearing in mind that this data is cross-sectional, this does maybe suggest to us that maybe the same mechanisms might be driving social anxiety in both the neurotypical and autistic adolescents. And finally, in our structural equation modelling, we found that when controlling for levels of autistic traits, greater hypersensitivity and alexithymia significantly predicted greater social anxiety. However, for the autistic adolescents, we also found that intolerance of uncertainty did play quite an important role as well. So in terms of future directions, I hope this research goes some way to helping us understand more about the etiology of social anxiety in autistic and neurotypical adolescents, as there isn't a great deal of work looking at social anxiety, particularly in autistic adolescents at the moment. I also hope that this research will help us to inform interventions to look at alleviating symptoms of social anxiety in both of these groups. And what it might suggest to us is that interventions that tackle social anxiety in neurotypical adolescents can perhaps be transferred to those in autistic adolescents, although we have to bear in mind that there are many differences that autistic adolescents experience that we may need to cater for. And finally, I think that this research, particularly in autistic adolescents, may speak to targeting specific mechanisms, for example, intolerance of uncertainty. And going forward, I think we need definitely to build a much bigger picture of the etiology of social anxiety in autistic adolescents. We also need to replicate these findings and extend them to different populations, for example, younger children and older adults, and to know whether the mechanisms are the same at these different